1963 by Robert P. Fitton, a sequel to 1961. When I traveled to Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, it was a cold day, dank, and rather lonely and cloudy in the plaza. I began to think about the book I was writing and how I would want to construct it. As I connected the book with 1961, many years have passed for Patch Kincaid, and he's like the ancient mariner, relegated to telling JFK's story again and again, because something he did back in 1961 actually changed history and caused Kennedy to be assassinated. When I first wrote the book 1961, it was called Redshift, and that was just a little twist at the end, which evolved into rewriting the 1961 book and actually connecting it with a book that would bring Patch back to try and stop the Kennedy assassination. Of course, there are many variables that happen in this book, 1963. Patch, I said in 1961, was like Telemachus on an Odyssey. In 1963, still on the Odyssey, he becomes a witness to part of Lee Oswald's life in 1963, and in essence, a witness for the readers and the listeners of 1963. It's become abundantly clear that Oswald did not kill President Kennedy. What I wanted to accomplish in 1963 was to have Patch and Shari, through their own eyes, view what is substantiated about some of the events of Lee Oswald's life in the summer and fall of 1963. Now, Patch is being harassed by the government, being told to get out of Dealey Plaza. He says he's only selling tapes. He's only giving Kennedy's life in book form and DVD. But here's the stitch in time which allows us to go forward into a time travel adventure. A dark-eyed young man comes into Dealey Plaza explaining to Patch that they need his help to go back in time. Patch, of course, is suspicious because all the time travel paraphernalia, all the tapes, all the computer records of the time travel experiments have been stowed away. But he soon learns that that material has been pilfered. It's been pilfered by a scientist who was subjected to some of the CIA experiments on LSD in France in the early 50s. We don't know what this guy, Dr. Alexander Moon, is really going to do. Moon has begun his experiments on foreign soil in China, Hong Kong. Patch asks about his mentor, Ray Mankiewicz, who is now old and near death in Florida. Interestingly, in the beginning of the book, a woman with short white hair comes into the plaza. She tells Patch that she had never planned to come down here to see where Kennedy had been killed, that everyone in her generation could never get over it. He actually escorts her onto the street to see the spot where Kennedy received his fatal headshot. The interesting thing about this woman, she is the woman that Patch will meet back in time in her younger years, and she will become, with him, a witness to many of the things that Lee Oswald was involved in before the assassination of President Kennedy. Most things that people don't even know. In a wild chase out of the plaza, Patch is abducted and flown to Alaska by the government operatives. In Alaska, they administer in true fashion an attack on his memory. Patch has a general knowledge, but of the Kennedy assassination and what happened, that has been removed from his memory, his conscious and unconscious memory. With this singed memory, Patch is removed by elements of the Chinese who fly him to Hong Kong, and eventually he meets up with Dr. Moon in one of the high rises in Hong Kong. Dr. Moon, always looking as if he could be derailed at any second, convinces Patch to follow him under the harbor to join his time project. This project is a massive ring which has been set up under the harbor in Hong Kong, way below the surface and completely carved out of the inner earth. This is the new time travel chamber. Unbeknownst to Patch, Mankiewicz was not as bad as the government operatives were saying. They sent Mankiewicz over to Hong Kong with one of the colonels, McCabe, that has been following Patch. As they monitor Patch, Mankiewicz slips in some vital information for Patch. He knows that Patch will try to go back to 1963. This information says that the gangster, Johnny Rosselli, will be at Dodger Stadium on a certain day, at a certain time, in a certain game. Patch receives this information as he's working on some of the hardware for Dr. Moon. Patch eventually escapes and runs into the tunnel, but that tunnel is leading him back in time. Moon is chasing him, armed and dangerous. Patch ends up in Spokane, Washington, and actually he meets a younger version of the woman in the plaza, as she's the girl taking the tickets in front of a movie theater in Spokane. And he doesn't even have any money. She lets him in anyway and ends up talking to him, but as she talks to him, she suddenly realizes that he doesn't know who he is, but she's a little bit concerned. Little by little, she helps him along the way. Patch has that piece of paper, that readout that has Johnny Rosselli's name on it and the game at Dodger Stadium. She actually ends up driving him all the way to Los Angeles, because after talking to Patch, she can see that something else is going on here. When Patch and Shari arrive at the game, they meet with Rosselli, and what is shocking to Shari is that Rosselli knows Patch. Not only does he know Patch, but he's totally indebted to him, as are his friends, for saving their lives back in 1961. Carlos Sanchez was gunning for Johnny Rosselli and some of his other friends, and Rosselli knew that Patch trailed Carlos Sanchez, and Mankiewicz eventually killed him. Patch has Johnny Rosselli's complete trust, and somebody is needed for what Rosselli has in mind. Rosselli knows that certain people need surveillance on this character, Lee Oswald, and he does trust Patch and will pay him huge amounts of money to keep close tabs on this operation. He sends Patch out to a racetrack to get his final instructions. By now, Shari is baffled and wonders if Patch is an assassin or works for the mob. And again, a little by little, she agrees after this guy, Walter Piscani, sends them to Las Vegas to meet with Louis McWillie, who was friends with Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby shows up at the Thunderbird. I try and keep him in character with what I've known, what I've read, the biographies and everything, and have him say some of the things that I know that he said. He idolized McWillie, and that's evident by what we see in the book. Ruby's assignment is to bring them to Dallas. Now, this isn't the Dallas of November, it's the Dallas at the end of July and beginning of August. From there, they will get their instructions on exactly what they're going to do. And I stop at actual places like Campese's Egyptian restaurant, and some of the characters that are floating around there are actual real characters. And I should note, everything in this book that makes an assertion of an actual event, not some fictitious thing that I made up, but the way somebody acted or the event that actually came down is all footnoted and sourced. For instance, once Patch and Shari are in New Orleans, the testimony by Carlos Bernier of the altercation with Lee Oswald and what Oswald said in his store is actually brought forth in the book. I also brought in Oswald's debate, which I thought was important, and the things that he talked about on the radio. One of the most important things happened in September when he met with David Atlee Phillips at the Southland Center in Dallas. This is a huge thing with this little old Lee Oswald meeting with one of the higher-ups in the CIA less than 90 days before the assassination of President Kennedy. Patch and Shari are flown to Chicago, where Rosselli has set them up with Richard Kane. What comes out of that is a meeting briefly with Thomas Arthur Valley, who was set up as the patsy for the Chicago plot. Patch discovers guns and everything else, and the outlines of that plot as he goes to Chicago. They make contact with the triple agent Richard Nagel. I call him Pilatus. Pilatus really doesn't know what's going on with Patch, but in light of what he's surveilling with Oswald and who he's working for, he's telling Patch at first just to stay out of this, and he seems to know everything that's going on with Patch and Shari and what they're up to. Cash just keeps on coming in P.O. boxes. This is very important to someone, and the address where they send their tapes and the summaries is in Austin, which is very similar to some of the law firms used by LBJ, which I don't insinuate anything about LBJ, only a possibility of prior knowledge. Pilatus shoots up a bank in El Paso on September 20th, 1963. He meets with Patch. I wanted to lay out a lot of information that he would know. The reason he's passing it on to Patch is because he's going to flash out of sight and into the federal penitentiary system and get out of this assassination thing. But he's left this knowledge with Patch. He wants to know if Oswald is on the bus going down to Mexico City, because he didn't know. Oswald was not on the bus. I tracked the whole Mexico thing. When I first wrote this, I ended up writing 2 scenarios because I didn't know what happened with Oswald. But I finally came to the conclusion after reading multiple books and accounts and just sorting through what's available. He was never down there. That this whole thing was drummed up by Hunt and Phillips. Patch and Shari get split after that trip to Mexico. Later on, he's in Tampa. And one of my favorite scenes in this entire book, and it's substantiated by a photograph where Kennedy is actually standing up in a limo in a residential neighborhood right with the people. It's a fantastic photograph. I have Patch at the corner there, and he shakes Kennedy's hand. Little dribs and drabs of the assassination are coming into his head, but he can't put it all together, and he just tells Kennedy, he has to be careful like that. And Kennedy just makes the quote that he made in 1960, I believe it was, where, you're running for president, you've got to be out with the people. And then the limousine takes off and Patch heads for Dallas. Jack Ruby is seen in the Cabana Hotel with some mobsters from Chicago, from Jim Braden. When Patch and Shari are found out, and they actually are chased out of there and they're on the run 12 hours before the assassination of Kennedy, and it all comes back to Patch what's going to happen. They know they can't call the police because the police are after them, the FBI is after them. The only way they can do it is to stop the motorcade or stop the assassination the next day. That's when the entire thing unwinds. That's when it gets into very detailed, substantiated facts about what happened in that plaza. In my latest version, I get into the head wounds a little bit more specifically than I did in the earlier versions, and I think it's very accurate with what happened. But everything that leads into that plaza and all the events that happened before that, who is where, who sees what, other people that might be there, taken from witnesses, placed all together for Patch to see. Now, Patch is being pulled into the future from this retrograde I mentioned in my 1961 book. Retrograde is the elastic tension that draws somebody back right into the future, but since things were unstable, he's still within this bubble, which allows us to slow everything down and watch everything from slow motion. From Lee Oswald being in the lunchroom in front of the depository, it's all slowed down, as are the shots that come to kill President Kennedy and wound Governor Connally and others. I think that part of the book, from the cabana on to the shooting, no one read any part of the book. That part is worth reading. It highlights a lot of things that really did happen. For people to postulate that Oswald was a loner and pulled off this assassination, this really puts that to rest.